The Resident Evil 4 remake has taken the gaming world by storm for the 12th time. But which version of the game is the definitive release? The 2005 original, 2021's VR version, or this year's remake? Let's find out. Resident Evil 4 revolutionized gaming upon release in 2005, introducing the over-the-shoulder third-person gameplay that continues to be replicated to this day. It's often cited as one of the greatest video games of all time, and for good reason. But if you're new to the series or played a few of the more recent games, you're probably wondering whether it's really worth the hype. Should you drop $60 on the new remake? Or is the original a better bargain at only $20 MSRP, often on sale for less? Or maybe you're thinking about going all in and buying it on VR. And while all three are valid options, one of them does stand out from the rest. Let's get the obvious right out of the way first. If you can't stand the sight of something without ray tracing or current gen graphics, your only pick is gonna be the remake. While the HD version of the original, available on all modern consoles, does boast an impressive 60 FPS, and the VR version pushes the graphics as far as they can go, they're no match for the detail and rendering of the newest remake. Enemies are imposing, environments are lifelike, and the presentation is so much sleeker overall. That isn't to say the original isn't without its charm, however. It holds up incredibly well for an 18-year-old game, save for some clunky controls, dated textures, and cheesy dialogue.
I'm sure you boys didn't just tag along so we could sing Kumbaya together at some Boy Scout bonfire.
Looking back, I even preferred the music in the original and VR versions. Despite the remake's soundtrack having a few shining moments, the original and VRs are just too iconic. The VR version and the original are almost completely identical at their core, with the most obvious exception being that the VR version is all from a first-person perspective. And while there aren't major differences in story or content, the experience manages to feel entirely different. Resident Evil 4 in VR is without a doubt the best virtual reality game that I've ever played. Reaching to your chest to grab your combat knife or reaching down to your holster to draw your gun is thrilling every single time. While the original Resident Evil 4 and the remake make Leon feel badass, the VR version makes you as the player feel badass. Having to reload manually in the heat of combat is intense and thrilling, and traversing around the map so smoothly feels like pure adrenaline. But this smoothness can detract from the experience at times, as it becomes so easy to avoid foes that I hardly ever felt any real stakes or threat. It feels like having the training wheels on. And in the original, it's the opposite. The clunky movement seems to work against you, and it can feel unfairly challenging at times. The remake avoids these pitfalls and manages to strike the perfect balance of challenge and fairness. You won't be roller skating around the terrain, but you won't feel like you're playing with a joystick either. Gunplay is satisfying across all versions and each have their own enjoyable quirks. You really can't go wrong no matter how you kill the chainsaw guy.
Stay down, alright?
One element that I wish the new game pushed further, however, is stealth. The prospect of being able to crouch and sneak towards or past enemies was something that really excited me, as it isn't an option in the original or VR versions. And while there were a few segments where that was possible, stealth still takes a huge backseat to explosive shootouts. I really wish players would have had more of an option to avoid combat to conserve ammo, like 2014's The Evil Within, directed by original Resident Evil 4 director Shinji Mikami. The Evil Within's stealth mechanics were well executed, and because ammo actually felt scarce there, stealth became a necessary part of survival. Here, ammo is so plentiful that stealth feels like you're just wasting your time. I understand that the developers didn't want to stray too far from the original for fear of alienating players, but I think this would have really gone a long way in improving my experience even further. The knife and parry system in the remake is a huge advantage over the other two editions, with Leon's combat knife now being able to block incoming weapons, tentacles, and yes, even chainsaws. Whenever a game adds in weapon durability, I hesitate to get excited, as I often find it more annoying than I do challenging. I'm looking at you, Breath of the Wild. But the RE4 remake gets it right, allowing you to collect more knives along the way and repair them at the merchant as they weaken. Definitely makes you think twice about wasting your knife away, but isn't so punishing that you never want to use it. The story in the remake remains largely unchanged, so if you're fresh off of 2020's RE3 remake and want to continue the story, Playing the original is a completely valid option, and you won't miss out on anything game-changing. It's also worth noting that the story carryover between most Resident Evil games is extremely minimal, with only passing references to previous events. Each game can be played exclusively by itself, and you'll still be able to follow along. It's not like the story in RE4 is that great to begin with, in any of the versions.
I don't ever remember being a part of your crappy script.
There is a narrative, but it doesn't really flow from beginning to end in the same way that other modern story games like The Last of Us do. It's incredibly contrived and entirely plot-driven. Stuff just kinda happens because it can. You'll probably wonder things like, why am I fighting the giant troll from Lord of the Rings right now? Or why am I fighting the Loch Ness Monster? Or why are you the only person sent to look for the president's daughter? Why am I— Just shut up and play. In the remake, I really wish Capcom was willing to take the story in a more exciting direction, however. Shinji Mikami is on record as saying they only had 2.5 weeks to come up with the story for the game versus the typical 6 months. And it definitely shows.
But you're okay, right?
Yeah, but he could have killed me, but he let me live.
There's certainly a campy charm to the original and VR versions that are reminiscent of 80s B-movies. And if that's your cup of tea, you'll likely enjoy how balls to the wall crazy and dumb it gets. Meanwhile, the remake tries to meld that campiness with the tone of the previous 2 remakes to create a middle ground that should be much more palatable for new players. Listen, I get it. I understand that Capcom wanted to play it safe, especially after seeing the backlash from fans just for removing the line,
No thanks, bro.
but surely, after 18 years, someone could have conceived of a more interesting villain than the love child of Captain Crunch and Queen Elizabeth II. The remake also removes a boss from the original and VR versions, likely to be used for DLC down the line. Because if there's one thing you can count on these days, it's game developers charging you extra money for stuff that should have been in the game to start. To the remake's credit, they do attempt to improve Leon's character by making him less of an untouchable action star and more so someone shaped by the events of Resident Evil 2. But I wish they would have explored that even further and really given him some more depth, perhaps exploring his PTSD from Raccoon City. But the game's quick pace just doesn't allow for that, and honestly, that's fine. Resident Evil 4 embraces its video gaminess and prioritizes its gameplay above all else. That's why it's held up so well over the years. It's over the top, action-packed, challenging, rewarding, and highly replayable. Every single level in RE4 is like a greatest hit, and while you'll certainly have your favorites, the fact that you'll likely remember all 16 chapters is a huge accomplishment. The game is split into 3 sections: the village, the castle, and the island. Each of these locations has a distinct feel, with the first feeling like the biggest departure from the series due to its large exteriors and daytime segments. In the original, these levels have the same flat lighting throughout, so it's nice that in the remake, different areas have much more distinct atmospheres. The castle area feels the most like the previous Resident Evil games, with greater claustrophobia, lots of puzzles, and necessary backtracking for previously seen loot. It also features one of the most suspenseful segments in the whole game, where you play as Ashley, the president's daughter. As Ashley, you can't fight back, instantly raising the stakes and the scares. All 3 versions of this mission are great, with the remasters being the longest and most fully realized. It kinda plays like an episode of Scooby-Doo, complete with haunted nights and hidden doors. And once you reach the island, you'll be greeted by some of the most terrifying enemies in the whole franchise. If you're craving a survival horror experience, the original certainly feels the furthest from it. While the differences in lighting, textures, and character designs obviously play a huge role in this, it also has to do with the animations for the enemies you face. Every enemy moves the same, and they never feel all that aggressive. In the remake, these will charge full speed at you without mercy with much more unpredictability. The VR version has the added intensity of the Ganados getting right up in your face close enough to kiss you, but the remake manages the biggest scares. But what about the endgame? Once you beat the campaign, what is there left to do? Well, in the original, 3 extra minigames of varying lengths, including a small campaign for a key supporting character, Ada, were included as a reward for completion. It's actually pretty fun, and it has a Back to the Future 2 vibe where you revisit early sections from the main game from a different perspective, revealing new details that flesh out the story, even if only slightly. The VR version and the remake are both lacking the added campaigns, but all 3 do include Mercenaries mode, Mercenaries mode has you trying to kill as many enemies as possible before time runs out. It's a harmless mode that can be fun for a bit, but don't expect much longevity out of it. But what the game really hopes you'll do is replay the adventure all over again. Finishing the game unlocks New Game Plus mode, in which you can start all over but keep your weapons and upgrades from before. If you're someone who enjoys getting achievements and completing challenges, then no doubt you'll be the most motivated with the Resident Evil 4 Remake, as it has the most to offer in that regard. The game is incredibly fun the first time around though, and while replaying the same game right after completion may not be everyone's cup of tea, if it is, you'll certainly get your money's worth. And since the original offers something similar, plus it has the 3 extra modes, all for only $20 or less, it's definitely the best bargain of the 3. So, which version of the game is truly the best? While VR offers immersion unlike anything else I've ever played, I can't say that it's the best way to experience the game, especially on a first playthrough. The lack of challenge and the inability to play for long periods of time due to inevitable motion sickness really works against the game. But between the OG and the remake, which one reigns supreme? The remake takes a strong foundation and builds upon it, but there's some wasted potential when it comes to story and stealth. And if you're not someone who enjoys replaying games, the $60 asking price may be too high for you for a less than 20-hour campaign.
I don't know if I can.
You can.
Conversely, the original is always priced at a great deal of $20 or below and lacks microtransactions or cut content. But the gameplay and graphics are certainly dated, with the controls taking a while to get used to. Ultimately, I think the best experience is the 2023 remake. It's the ideal starting point for both new and returning players, satisfying both camps with engaging action and gorgeous level design. Those looking for the scariest experience of the 3 need look no further, and it's the best example of what a remaster should be. It takes what made the original so great and cranks it up to 11. The original is a perfect budget option for those looking to continue the story of the franchise without breaking the bank, but the remaster is truly the best all-around experience. So with all that being said,
What are you buying?